Most men believe manipulation is loud, obvious, and intentional. They imagine control looks like arguments, demands, or dramatic ultimatums. That belief is exactly why influence works so effectively in modern relationships. The most powerful tactics are not forceful. They are subtle. They do not feel like pressure. They feel emotional, reasonable, and human. Real influence operates quietly. It works through emotional signals rather than commands. Guilt, reassurance, affection, distance, vulnerability, silence, and approval are not random behaviors. They are leverage points. And leverage works best when the person being influenced believes they are acting freely. This is the uncomfortable truth most men never confront. Men are rarely controlled through dominance. They are guided through emotional triggers they do not fully understand. When emotions rise, judgment often narrows. Reaction replaces reflection. Effort replaces clarity. Over time, this creates patterns where a man gives more than he intended, explains more than necessary, and compromises without understanding why. Once those patterns settle, they become difficult to break. This is not about blaming women. Influence exists in all human interaction. Everyone uses it, often unconsciously. The difference is awareness. The person who understands influence remains aligned with choice. The person who does not becomes predictable. Stoic psychology challenges a common belief that being emotionally available without boundaries is always virtuous. In reality, emotional openness without self-governance creates vulnerability to influence. Not because others are malicious, but because unguarded emotion invites control. This video is not about becoming cold or defensive. It is about removing blindness. Influence only works in the dark. Once it is seen clearly, it begins to lose its power. One of the most common forms of emotional influence is withdrawal disguised as confusion, overwhelm, or emotional distance. It rarely appears aggressive or confrontational. In fact, it often looks vulnerable. A woman may become quieter, less responsive, or emotionally unavailable without clearly explaining why. Most men interpret this shift as a problem to solve rather than a signal to observe. This is where leverage quietly forms. Emotional withdrawal creates absence. Absence creates discomfort. Discomfort creates urgency. And urgency pushes action. Men who are emotionally invested often respond by asking questions, offering reassurance, changing behavior, or increasing effort to restore the previous emotional connection. The intention feels caring. The effect is reinforcement. The key detail most men miss is this: the withdrawal itself is not the leverage. The reaction to it is. When a man rushes to resolve emotional distance, he teaches the dynamic that discomfort will be rewarded with attention and effort. Over time, emotional access becomes a tool for regulating behavior, even if no one is consciously intending it. Stoic psychology offers a different response. A grounded man does not panic when warmth fades temporarily. He remains present without overcorrecting. He allows space to exist without immediately trying to fill it. This does not mean becoming cold or indifferent. It means refusing to regulate someone else's emotions at the expense of his own stability. When emotional withdrawal is met with calm consistency rather than urgency, it loses its leverage. Either the connection naturally stabilizes or misalignment reveals itself. Both outcomes provide clarity. Inaction, when guided by awareness, often reveals truth faster than emotional chasing ever could. Guilt is one of the most powerful emotional forces in human interaction because it does not feel like control. It feels like conscience. Most men believe guilt appears only when someone directly accuses or blames them. In reality, the most effective form of guilt is subtle, indirect, and emotionally framed as disappointment rather than demand. A shift in tone, a disappointed silence, or a comment about feeling unappreciated can be enough to activate it. Men who are emotionally invested often respond automatically. They begin scanning their behavior for mistakes. They ask themselves what they did wrong and how to fix it. The moment a man enters self-correction mode without clear responsibility, leverage has already formed. Guilt works because many men tie their sense of worth to being seen as good, understanding, and emotionally responsible. When that identity feels threatened, the instinct is to restore approval as quickly as possible. This often leads to overgiving, more time, more effort, more compromise, not because a boundary was crossed, but because emotional discomfort needs relief. This does not require malicious intent. Most people are not consciously using guilt as a tool. They express feelings, and the other person reacts. But repeated reactions create patterns. When guilt reliably produces compliance, it becomes leverage, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. Stoic psychology draws a clear line between empathy and obligation. A Stoic man listens to emotion without immediately assuming fault. He pauses before correcting. He asks whether the guilt aligns with his values, actions, and boundaries. If it does, he takes responsibility calmly. If it does not, he remains steady without defensiveness. When guilt no longer dictates behavior, emotional influence weakens. Clarity replaces reflex, and leverage dissolves. Affection and approval are among the most powerful forms of influence because they feel positive. Unlike guilt or withdrawal, they do not create discomfort at first. They create warmth, and warmth naturally lowers emotional defenses. This is why most men never question influence that feels good. Affection becomes leverage when it is inconsistent. When warmth, praise, attention, or intimacy appear in response to specific behaviors and fade when those behaviors stop, a pattern forms. The man may not consciously recognize it, but his nervous system does. Certain actions become associated with emotional reward, while others become associated with distance or tension. Over time, behavior begins to shift without a single demand being made. This does not require deliberate strategy. Many people respond instinctively to what feels pleasant and withdraw from what feels uncomfortable. The influence emerges not from intention, but from repetition. When approval becomes the reward, it quietly becomes the currency. The danger is not affection itself. Healthy relationships include warmth, validation, and closeness. The danger appears when a man begins acting to maintain approval rather than acting from alignment. He adjusts tone, softens boundaries, or avoids certain choices not because they are wrong, but because they might disrupt emotional harmony. Stoic psychology challenges the assumption that feeling good always means doing right. Pleasure is feedback, not instruction. A Stoic man enjoys affection without chasing it. He receives approval without depending on it. His standards and values remain consistent whether warmth is present or absent. When approval no longer dictates behavior, its leverage disappears. Affection becomes genuine instead of conditional. And if warmth fades because influence no longer works, the connection reveals its true nature. That clarity is not loss, it is alignment. Vulnerability is often described as the foundation of emotional intimacy, and in healthy relationships, it truly is. Sharing fears, insecurities, and past pain allows two people to understand each other more deeply. But vulnerability can also become a subtle form of influence when it shifts responsibility instead of simply sharing experience. When a woman expresses emotional pain, fear, or insecurity, a man who is emotionally invested often feels an immediate pull to protect, reassure, or fix the situation. These instincts are natural. The shift happens when vulnerability becomes a reason rather than an explanation. Instead of saying, "This is how I feel," the emotion begins to justify expectations, reactions, or repeated patterns. Over time, a man may start adjusting his behavior not because something is objectively misaligned, but because he does not want to cause emotional discomfort or appear insensitive. His decisions become guided by avoidance of guilt rather than clarity of intention. Responsibility quietly transfers, and emotional balance becomes uneven. This dynamic does not require conscious manipulation. Often, the person expressing vulnerability is not aware of the effect. She shares emotion, the man adjusts, and the pattern reinforces itself. Psychology does not depend on intent, it depends on repetition. Stoic psychology does not reject empathy, it refines it. A Stoic man listens without absorbing responsibility that is not his. He acknowledges emotion without immediately changing direction. He separates understanding from obligation. When vulnerability no longer produces automatic compliance, it returns to its healthy role. Emotional sharing becomes a bridge to understanding, not a mechanism of control. Boundaries do not weaken intimacy, they protect it. A man who understands this supports without self-erasure and remains grounded under emotional pressure. Urgency is one of the most underestimated forces in human psychology because it feels practical rather than emotional. When time pressure appears, the mind shifts into problem-solving mode and bypasses reflection. Decisions become reactive. Relief becomes the priority. This is why urgency is such an effective form of influence. Most men associate urgency with obvious moments, deadlines, ultimatums, or last-minute demands. In reality, it is often subtle. A situation is framed as fragile. A response is needed right now to prevent misunderstanding, emotional fallout, or loss. The moment urgency enters, clarity begins to fade. Under time pressure, a man stops evaluating alignment and starts prioritizing resolution. He compromises plans, rushes reassurance, or agrees to things he would normally question. None of this feels like being controlled. It feels like being responsible. That is exactly why it works. Stoic psychology exposes the flaw in this pattern. Urgency is rarely a fact. It is often a framing. Decisions that truly matter can withstand calm consideration. If a choice cannot survive a pause, it is usually not aligned. A Stoic man does not ignore urgency, but he does not surrender to it. He slows the moment. He creates space before acting. This space allows intention to surface instead of fear. When urgency is met with steadiness rather than reaction, its leverage disappears. Most men fear that slowing down will cause loss. In reality, calm pacing communicates self-command. When urgency no longer produces instant compliance, the dynamic must adjust. Either the request becomes clearer and more reasonable, or it dissolves entirely. Both outcomes reveal truth, and truth restores judgment.
Every influence tactic discussed so far relies on one underlying vulnerability: external validation. A man who needs approval, reassurance, or emotional harmony to feel stable becomes predictable. Predictability creates leverage. Men who regulate their self-worth through response are especially vulnerable. When attention feels like value, silence feels like rejection. When approval feels like safety, disapproval feels like threat. In this state, emotional shifts do not simply register as information, they feel personal. Reaction replaces choice. This is why influence works so quietly. It does not need force. It only needs access to validation. When a man measures his worth through emotional feedback, guilt moves him, withdrawal unsettles him, affection shapes him, vulnerability redirects him, and urgency rushes him. Not because he is weak, but because his emotional center is external. Stoic psychology removes this vulnerability by relocating worth internally. A Stoic man does not require constant affirmation to remain grounded. Approval is appreciated, not needed. Disagreement does not destabilize identity. Silence does not threaten self-respect. When validation is no longer the currency, influence loses its leverage. Guilt no longer demands compliance because responsibility is evaluated, not assumed. Withdrawal no longer creates panic because connection does not define identity. Affection remains enjoyable, but no longer shapes direction. This is why emotionally grounded men feel difficult to influence, not because they resist or dominate, but because they are self-directed. Their choices come from alignment, not emotional gravity. And where validation no longer controls behavior, influence has nowhere to take hold.
The Stoic response to emotional influence is not confrontation, exposure, or resistance. It is composure. Influence depends on reaction. When stimulus consistently meets emotional steadiness, the entire mechanism collapses. A Stoic man does not accuse or attempt to outmaneuver anyone. He observes. He slows the interaction. He remains aligned with his values regardless of emotional pressure. This calm awareness removes the reward that influence depends on. Without urgency, overreaction, or emotional overcorrection, tactics lose their effect. This does not mean becoming distant or emotionally unavailable. It means responding intentionally instead of reflexively. A Stoic man communicates clearly and simply. He sets boundaries without defensiveness. He does not over-explain or justify his position. His actions reflect direction, not reaction. When this composure becomes consistent, people adjust. Those seeking genuine connection respond to clarity with respect. Those relying on emotional leverage find no entry point and naturally disengage. Both outcomes serve alignment. Most men believe power comes from controlling situations or people. Stoic psychology teaches the opposite. True power comes from self-governance. When a man controls his reactions, no external tactic can control his behavior. Once this mindset is embodied, influence fades into irrelevance. Emotional pressure loses its grip. Decisions return to clarity rather than urgency. And clarity creates healthy dynamics without conflict. This is not about winning against anyone. It is about reclaiming control over oneself. When you are grounded, influence has nowhere to land, and that is real strength.